The winter of 1882 came to Arizona territory like a whispered threat cold enough to remind men they were mortal, but not cold enough to kill. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his ranch house at dawn, watching the sun break over the White River Basin with the same hollow attention he gave to everything these days. The light spread slowly across the desert, turning the sand from gray to gold, and he felt nothing. At 43 years old, Elias had the kind of face that made strangers look away. Not because he was ugly, but because something in his eyes suggested he had seen things that should not be spoken of. His jaw was perpetually tight. His shoulders held the rigid posture of a man who had worn a uniform too long, and his hands, rough and scarred, never seemed to rest completely. Even now, holding a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold, his fingers twitched with a tremor he could not control. 3 months had passed since the Skeleton Canyon massacre. 3 months since the newspapers had screamed about Apache raiders and justified retaliation. 3 months since Elias had stopped reading newspapers altogether. He lived alone on 40 acres of scrubland that nobody else wanted, a patch of earth carved between 2 dry creek beds that only ran water 3 months of the year. His cabin was small, built from pine he had hauled himself, with a single room that served as kitchen bedroom and the place where he tried unsuccessfully to sleep each night. There was a barn that leaned dangerously to the left, a corral that held 3 horses he rarely rode, and a well that gave clean water if you were patient enough to wait for it. Elias Thorne was not a rancher. He was not a farmer. He was a man trying very hard to disappear. The problem with disappearing was that the past had a way of following. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw the same scene replayed with cruel precision. Cibecue Creek, August 1881. The smell of gunpowder and blood mixing in the desert air, the screams that had started loud and ended in wet silence. And the girl. Always the girl. He had been a military surgeon, then attached to the 6th Cavalry under Colonel Carr. His job had been simple in theory. Treat the wounded soldiers, keep them alive long enough to fight another day. But at Cibecue Creek the orders had changed. When the Apache camp had been overrun, when the shooting had stopped and the counting of bodies had begun, Elias had found her among the wounded. A young woman, maybe 19, with a bullet hole in her side and eyes that still held defiance, even as her life bled into the sand. He had tried to save her, against orders, against common sense, against everything he had been told about enemies and savages and the price of mercy in wartime. He had knelt beside her, his hands working fast to pack the wound to slow the bleeding. She had looked at him with confusion, first, then understanding. Her lips had moved, forming words in a language he did not speak. Then in broken English she had whispered something that haunted him still. "Thank you. You tried." And then she had driven a knife into his chest. Elias touched the scar through his shirt now, a habit he had developed over the past year. The blade had missed his heart by 2 inches. He had survived. She had not. A sergeant had put a bullet in her head while Elias lay gasping in the dirt. When he had recovered enough to ask questions, he learned her name had been Desba, that she had been unarmed, that the knife she had used on him had been taken from a dead soldier, that she had died protecting nothing because everyone she loved was already dead. The Army had given him a medical discharge and a pension. They had called him a hero for surviving an Apache attack. They had not asked why he had been trying to save an enemy combatant. They had not wanted to know. Elias had taken his pension and run. He had run all the way to this forgotten corner of Arizona, to this worthless patch of land. And he had built a life that required him to speak to no one and remember nothing. It was not working. He drank his cold coffee and watched the sun climb higher. In 2 hours he would need to ride into Fort Thomas for supplies. It was a trip he made once a month, always on a Tuesday when the town was quietest, always with his hat pulled low and his words kept to a minimum. The people there knew him as a former soldier who kept to himself. They did not know about Cibecue Creek. They did not know about the screams that woke him every night. Elias went inside and gathered his shopping list. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, the same items every month. He saddled his horse, a gray mare named Patience who lived up to her name, and began the slow ride toward town. Fort Thomas sat in a valley between two ridges, a collection of wooden buildings that pretended to be more important than they were. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that never closed, and a sheriff's office that rarely saw use. Most of the people who lived there were miners, ranchers, or men who had failed at both and settled for drinking instead. Elias tied Patience to the rail outside the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk. The store was dim and smelled of leather and tobacco. Elias nodded to Mr. Brennan, the owner, a 60-year-old man with kind eyes and a limp from an old mining accident. Brennan nodded back and asked no questions. This was why Elias came here. Brennan understood the value of silence. Elias was halfway through his list counting out coins for a bag of flour when the noise started outside. It began as laughter, the ugly kind that men made when they were drunk and looking for entertainment. Then came shouting. Elias tried to ignore it. He had learned long ago that other people's trouble was not his concern. He focused on the flour, on the weight of the bag, on anything except the commotion growing louder. But then he heard the word, Apache. His hands stopped moving. Mr. Brennan glanced toward the window, his expression troubled. Through the dusty glass, Elias could see a crowd forming in the street, 4 men miners by their clothes circling something. Someone. Elias told himself to stay inside, told himself it was not his business, told himself that getting involved would only lead to questions he could not answer. He walked to the window anyway. In the center of the circle stood an old Apache man. He was thin, his hair streaked with gray, his face carved deep with the lines of age and hardship. He wore traditional clothing, deerskin and beads, and carried a walking staff carved with symbols Elias did not recognize. The old man stood perfectly still, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the largest of the miners who was shouting at him. One of the miners, a thick-shouldered brute with a red face, shoved the old man hard in the chest. The Apache staggered, but did not fall. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He simply stood there, absorbing the insult with a dignity that made Elias's stomach turn. The crowd was growing. Women pulled their children away. Men watched with the casual interest of people who had seen this before and expected to see it again. No one stepped forward. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar weight. The same weight he had felt at Cowboy Creek when the sergeant had raised his pistol toward Desba's head. The weight of knowing something terrible was about to happen and having the power to stop it, but no courage to act. The red-faced miner drew back his fist. Elias's body moved before his mind could stop it. He pushed through the door of the general store, his boots hitting the boardwalk hard. The crowd turned to look at him. He ignored them. His eyes were locked on the old Apache man, and in that moment Elias saw something that made his heart stop. The old man's hands, the left one specifically. There were scars there, old scars, faded white lines that crossed the palm and wrapped around the wrist, the kind of scars that came from being bound, from struggling against rope or leather, from being tied down. Elias had seen those scars before. He had treated soldiers with similar marks, prisoners of war, men who had been captured and tortured. But these scars were older, much older. And there was something else. On the old man's forearm, barely visible beneath the leather sleeve, was another scar, a long, clean line, the kind left by a surgeon's scalpel when setting a broken bone. Elias's mind raced. The scar was in the exact position he had seen on wounded Apache fighters at Cowboy Creek. He had treated 3 men with broken arms that day. 3 men he had splinted and bandaged before the order came to finish the wounded. The old man turned his head slowly and looked directly at Elias. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed in the old man's face. Not surprise, not fear, just recognition. He knew. Somehow this old man knew exactly who Elias was. The red-faced miner was still shouting. The crowd was still watching, but Elias could hear none of it. All he could hear was the echo of Desba's voice. "Thank you. You tried." He stepped forward. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, not drawing it, not yet, just resting there. A statement. The crowd went quiet. Elias's voice when he spoke was low and steady, the voice of a man who had given orders in battle and expected them to be followed. Back away. The red-faced miner blinked at him, confusion cutting through his drunkenness. What's it to you? Thorn. Elias did not answer. He simply stood there, his hand on his gun, his eyes locked on the miner's face. Inside, his heart was hammering, his palms were sweating. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let this play out, to protect himself, but he could not move. The miner looked at Elias's hand, looked at his face, saw something there that made him hesitate. You ain't gonna shoot me over some old Indian? Elias's fingers curled around the grip of his revolver. I said back away. The silence stretched. The crowd held its breath. Finally, the red-faced miner spat into the dust and stepped back. His friends followed, muttering curses but not willing to push further. They retreated toward the saloon, casting angry glances over their shoulders. The crowd began to disperse. No one thanked Elias. No one acknowledged what had just happened. This was the way of frontier towns. Men minded their own business until it became someone else's problem. Elias turned to the old Apache man. Up close he could see the intelligence in those dark eyes, the strength that age had not diminished, and something else, a sadness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. The old man lifted his hand, slowly pressing his palm to his chest in a gesture of thanks. Then he did something unexpected. He spoke in perfect English. You carry blood on your hands, but also mercy. I see both. Elias felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The old man continued, his voice soft but clear. My name is Noel E. I know what you did at Sibicu Creek. I know you tried to save my sister Desba before she died. Elias's world tilted. The old man nodded slowly. She told me before she passed. A white soldier with gentle hands tried to stop her bleeding. She said she did not understand why. She said she stabbed him because she thought it was a trick. She died regretting that knife. Elias could not breathe. His chest felt tight, his vision narrowing. This man, this old Apache man, was Desba's brother. Noel E. reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small. He held it out to Elias. It was a strip of cloth stained brown with old blood. Elias recognized it immediately. It was the bandage he had tied around Desba's wound, the one that had not been enough. She kept this, Noel E. said quietly, even in her final moments. I have carried it since, waiting to find the man who tried. Elias took the cloth with shaking hands. He stared at it. This piece of his past made physical, and felt something break inside him, not cleanly, not mercifully, but break nonetheless. Why, he managed to whisper, why tell me this? Because Noel E. said tomorrow you will understand why mercy matters. Tomorrow I will send you a gift. Not because you deserve it, but because my sister's last wish was that the man who tried to save her should not die alone and haunted. Before Elias could respond, the old man turned and walked away. His gait was slow but steady, his staff tapping against the dirt with each step. The crowd parted for him this time. No one dared to touch him. Elias stood in the street, the bloody bandage clutched in his fist, his mind reeling. Around him, Fort Thomas returned to its normal rhythm. The blacksmith resumed hammering. The saloon doors swung open and closed. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Elias walked back to his horse in a daze. He loaded his supplies without remembering doing so. He rode home as the sun climbed toward noon, the heat pressing down on him like a judgment. When he reached his ranch, he did not go inside. He sat on the porch steps, the bandage still in his hand, and stared at nothing. Night fell. He did not move. He thought about Desba, about the way her eyes had held defiance even as she died, about the knife she had driven into his chest, about the thank you she had whispered. He thought about Noel E., about the scars on his hands, about the recognition in his eyes, about the promise of a gift. Elias did not sleep that night. He sat on his porch with his revolver in his lap, and his ghosts gathered close, waiting for dawn, waiting for whatever mercy or judgment tomorrow would bring. because one thing he knew with absolute certainty: nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The stars wheeled overhead. The desert breathed its cold night air. And Elias Thorne, the man who had spent a year trying to disappear, felt the world closing in around him once more. He was not afraid. Fear would have been easier. He was something worse. He was ready. Dawn came to the White River Basin with the kind of silence that precedes revelation. Elias had not moved from the porch steps. His body ached from sitting in one position all night, his joints stiff with cold, but he barely noticed. The revolver lay across his knees, his finger never quite touching the trigger, but never far from it either. He had watched the stars fade, one by one, had seen the sky turn from black to gray to the pale blue that promised sunrise, and through it all he had thought about what the old man had said. "Tomorrow you will understand why mercy matters." The words circled in his mind like vultures. Elias had stopped believing in mercy somewhere between Cibecue Creek and the moment he bought this worthless land. Mercy was a luxury afforded to men who had not seen what he had seen, who had not done what he had done. Mercy was for people who still believed the world operated on principles of fairness and justice. But Noel E. had spoken with such certainty, as if mercy was not a concept, but a concrete thing, something that could be measured and repaid. The sun broke over the eastern ridge at 6:17 in the morning. Elias knew this because he had counted every minute of the night, his mind too wired to rest, his body too tense to relax. The light spread across his small ranch, illuminating the corral where his horses stood sleeping on their feet, the leaning barn with its missing boards, the well with its frayed rope. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday, exactly as it had for the past year. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not the light tread of a single person, but the heavier rhythm of multiple people moving together. Elias's hand moved to his revolver instantly, his body shifting from exhausted stillness to coiled alertness in a heartbeat. He stood slowly, his back against the cabin wall, his eyes scanning the landscape. They came from the south, following the dry creek bed. 3 figures walking in a line, unhurried and deliberate. The rising sun was behind them, turning them into silhouettes, at first shapes without definition. But as they drew closer, Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. They were tall, impossibly tall. The first figure cleared the creek bed and stepped into full view, and Elias understood why his mind had initially refused to process what his eyes were seeing. She was a woman, that much was clear from her shape and the way she moved, but she stood at least 6.5 feet tall, perhaps more. Her shoulders were broad, her frame muscular in a way that suggested hard labor and harder living. She wore traditional Apache clothing, a deerskin dress decorated with beads and shells, but the garment strained against her body, the seams stretched tight across her chest and shoulders. Behind her came the second woman, slightly shorter but still towering over any man Elias had ever known. She moved with a grace that seemed at odds with her size, her steps measured and careful, as if she were used to moving through a world not built for her dimensions. Her hair was braided and hung down her back in a thick rope decorated with silver ornaments. The third was the youngest and the tallest. She walked with her head down her shoulders, hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. It did not work. She was enormous, her height pushing close to 6'8", her body still carrying the awkward proportions of someone who had not fully grown into their frame. She kept close to the second woman, almost hiding behind her despite being larger. Elias raised his revolver, not pointing it at them yet, but ready. His mind raced through possibilities. An attack, a trap, some elaborate revenge scheme by Noel E. for what happened at Cibecue Creek. But the women stopped 30 feet from his porch. The first one, the one with the muscular build and the confident stride, looked directly at him. Her face was striking high cheekbones and dark eyes that held no warmth but also no hostility, just a cold assessment, as if she were measuring him and finding him barely adequate. She spoke in Apache first, a rapid string of words that Elias did not understand. Then, in heavily accented but clear English, she said, "The elder Noel E. sends us. He said you would understand." Elias kept his gun up. "Understand what?" The woman did not flinch at the weapon. He said you carry a blood debt. He said you tried to save his sister Desba when others would have let her die. He said this debt must be honored. I don't want anything, Elias said, his voice rough. I didn't do it for trade. The second woman stepped forward. She was slimmer than the first, her face softer, her eyes holding an intelligence that made Elias feel exposed. When she spoke, her English was nearly perfect with only the barest trace of an accent. We are not a trade. We are a gift, but also a burden. She gestured to the other two women, then to herself. We cannot return to our people. We cannot stay in the white man's towns. The elders said you are the only man who might understand what it means to be cast out. Elias felt his gun hand waver. What are you talking about, cast out from what? The third woman, the youngest, spoke for the first time. Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear or shame or both. From everything. Because we are Yeitzo, giants. Cursed. The word hung in the air like smoke. Elias lowered his gun, slightly confusion overtaking caution. Cursed, how? The second woman answered. In our people's stories, giants are omens of disaster. When children are born too large, too different, they are seen as warnings from the spirits. Sometimes the children are killed at birth. Sometimes they are allowed to live but kept hidden, treated as shameful secrets. She paused, her dark eyes never leaving Elias's face. Our families paid the price for keeping us alive. My mother died in childbirth because I was too large. Nalnish's husband was killed defending her from those who wanted to burn her as a witch. Ashke's entire family was driven from their camp. Elias felt the gun grow heavy in his hand. These women were not attackers. They were refugees, outcasts, people with nowhere else to go. Just like him. The second woman continued, her voice steady despite the pain in her words. The elder Noel E. hid us for years, protected us. But he is old now, and he knows he does not have much time. Last night, after what you did in the town, he called us to him. He said he had found a man who understood that being different does not make you a monster. He said we should come to you. And if I refuse? Elias asked, though he already knew he would not. The first woman, Nalnish, smiled without humor. Then we walk into the desert and die. It is that simple. Silence fell over the ranch. The horses stirred in the corral, curious about the new arrivals. A hawk circled overhead, riding the early morning thermals. Elias stood on his porch. 3 giant Apache women stood in his yard, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He thought about Desba, about her final words, about the year he had spent trying to outrun his guilt and failing every single day. He thought about Noli's words, mercy matters. He lowered his revolver completely and holstered it. You can come inside, he said quietly. Nalnish's expression did not change, but something in her posture relaxed fractionally. The second woman nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement. The youngest Ashke looked up for the first time, her eyes wide with disbelief. They gathered their bundles, simple cloth wrappings that held what Elias assumed were their only possessions, and walked toward the cabin. As they passed him, he got his first real sense of their size. Nalnish was easily 7 inches taller than him, her shoulders broader than his by a significant margin. The second woman, despite being slightly shorter, still towered over him, and Ashke, the youngest, had to duck slightly to avoid hitting her head on the porch overhang. Inside the cabin that had seemed adequate for one person suddenly felt impossibly small. The 3 women filled the space, their presence transforming the room from a solitary refuge into something alive and crowded. Elias stood by the door, suddenly acutely aware of how sparse his life had become. 1 chair, 1 plate, 1 cup, everything measured for a man who expected to always be alone. Nalnish scanned the room with the eye of a soldier evaluating defensive positions. She moved to the window, checked the sight lines, then positioned herself near the door. Even relaxed, she held herself like someone ready to fight. The second woman set her bundle on the table and turned to Elias. I am called Kalyan. I am a healer among my people, or I was before they decided my size made my medicine cursed. She gestured to the fierce-looking woman by the door. This is Nyalnish. She was a warrior, one of the few women allowed to fight, until they decided a giant woman brought bad luck to war parties. The youngest woman stood near the stove, her hands clasped together, her eyes downcast. Kalyan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. And this is Ashki. She has seen only 19 summers, but she is the tallest of us all. Elias cleared his throat. My name is Elias Thorne. I was a military surgeon. I'm not anymore. Kalyan studied him with those penetrating eyes. The elder told us you carry scars, not just on your body. Elias touched his chest unconsciously, feeling the ridge of tissue where Desba's knife had entered. We all carry scars. Yes, Kalyan agreed softly. But some of us wear ours on the outside. She pulled back the sleeve of her dress, revealing her forearm. The skin there was marked with dozens of small scars, precise and deliberate. Every time someone in my village became sick after I was born, they cut me. They said it would release the bad spirits I carried. They stopped only when the elder threatened to leave the tribe if they continued. Nalnish spoke from her position by the door, her voice hard. They killed my husband when he stood between me and the fire they built. They said burning me would end a drought. When I survived only because he died protecting me, they called it proof of my curse. Ashki's voice was barely audible. My mother died giving birth to me. My father died trying to find enough food to feed me when I would not stop growing. My brothers and sisters were driven away because no one wanted to associate with the family of a giant. I am alone because I exist. Elias felt something crack inside his chest. These women had not just been cast out. They had been systematically destroyed by their own people piece by piece until nothing remained but their survival. Why did the elder send you to me? He asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. Kalyan sat down on his single chair without asking permission, a gesture that somehow felt right. Because last night the elder saw you defend him when no one else would. Because he has watched you for months living alone, punishing yourself for something that haunts you. Because he believes you understand what it means to be cast out by those who should have protected you. I'm not cast out, Elias protested weakly. I chose to leave. Did you? Kalyan tilted her head. Or did you leave because staying meant facing what you had become, facing the people who made you into something you hated? Elias had no answer to that. Kalyan stood and moved closer to him. Even trying to be non-threatening, her size was overwhelming. She reached into her bundle and pulled out something wrapped in soft leather. When she unfolded it, Elias saw a small object that made his heart stop. It was a scalpel, old worn, the blade stained with rust and old blood. But Elias recognized it. He had lost that scalpel at Sibicu Creek, dropped it in his panic when Desba stabbed him. The elder found this near his sister's body, Kalyan said softly. He has kept it all this time. He wanted you to have it back. He said to tell you that the tool of healing should not be buried with the dead. Elias took the scalpel with shaking hands. The weight of it was familiar, the balance exactly as he remembered. How many lives had he saved with this blade? How many had he failed to save? Kalyan's next words were barely a whisper, meant only for him. The elder told me something else, something he did not tell the others. She paused, her eyes searching his face. Desba was not just his sister. She was my mother. Elias's world tilted violently. Kalyan continued, her voice steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. I was cut from her body after she died. The elder told me she survived long enough to know I was alive, long enough to feel me move. He said her last words were about a white soldier with gentle hands who tried to stop her bleeding. He said she regretted the knife. I couldn't save her. Elias managed his throat tight. I tried, but I couldn't. I know, Kalyan said. But you tried. In that moment when you could have walked away, when you could have followed orders, you chose to try. That is why I am here. Not because you succeeded, because you tried. Elias looked at this tall, powerful woman and saw the ghost of Desba in her features. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant tilt to her chin, the same eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. He had failed to save the mother. Now the daughter stood in his cabin asking for refuge. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of symmetry. Nalnish spoke from the door, her tone practical. "We do not ask for charity. We can work. We are strong. We can help with your ranch with whatever you need. We ask only for shelter and safety." "And if I can't provide safety," Elias asked, "when people in town find out about you, there will be trouble." "There is always trouble," Nalnish replied. "The question is whether you will face it with us or send us away to face it alone." Elias looked at each of them in turn, Nalnish fierce and ready for battle, Kalyan wise and wounded, Ashki terrified and trying to disappear despite her impossible height. He thought about the year he had spent alone, the nights filled with nightmares, the days filled with empty routine, the slow grinding punishment of a life lived in isolation. He thought about Desba's whispered thank you. He thought about Noel E's words. "Mercy matters." "The bed is yours," he said finally. "I'll sleep by the fire. There's work enough for all of us if you're willing. And when trouble comes, we'll face it together." Kalyan smiled a real smile this time, warm and grateful. Ashki's shoulders dropped as tension flooded out of her. Even Nalnish's expression softened slightly, though her hand never moved far from the knife at her belt. They unpacked their meager belongings in silence. Elias moved about the cabin, suddenly aware of how little he had, how unprepared he was for guests. He had one pot, one pan, a sack of beans, and some dried meat. Hardly enough to feed himself, let alone 3 women whose size suggested they would need substantial portions. Kalyan seemed to read his thoughts. "We are used to making little go far, and I know which plants in the desert can be eaten. We will not starve." As the sun climbed higher, they settled into an uneasy routine. Nalnish inspected the perimeter of the ranch, checking fence lines and sight lines with professional efficiency. Kalyan began sorting through the wild plants growing near the creek, gathering herbs and roots. Ashki stayed close to the cabin, watching Elias with wide, uncertain eyes. Elias found himself working alongside them, and for the first time in a year, the silence of his ranch was broken by voices, by movement, by life. That night he lay on a blanket by the fire while the 3 women shared his bed. He could hear them breathing in the darkness, could hear the occasional whisper in Apache, could hear the creak of the wooden frame under their combined weight. He stared at the ceiling beams and wondered what he had done, wondered if he had made a terrible mistake, wondered if offering mercy was the same as courting disaster. But underneath the worry was something else, something he barely recognized because it had been absent for so long. He was not alone. For better or worse, his life of isolation was over. 3 giant Apache women now lived under his roof, 3 outcasts seeking refuge with a man who had been running from his own ghosts. Elias closed his eyes and for the first time in months fell asleep without the aid of whiskey. His dreams were still haunted. But now in the darkness he was not facing them alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town would find out. Questions would be asked. Threats might be made. But tonight in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, 4 broken people had found each other. And that, Elias thought as sleep finally claimed him, might be the only kind of mercy that actually mattered. The fire burned low. The desert night pressed close. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waited with patient inevitability. The first full day began before sunrise. Elias woke to the sound of movement in the cabin, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver that lay beside his makeshift bed on the floor. But it was only Kalyan moving quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, building up the fire in the stove. She moved with surprising grace for someone so large, her steps careful and measured, as if she were used to navigating spaces not designed for her size. She noticed him watching and nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "I did not mean to wake you." "I'm a light sleeper," Elias replied, sitting up and folding his blanket. His back ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but he had endured worse, much worse. "Always have been. Worse since the war." Kalyan fed kindling into the stove, her movements practiced and efficient. The firelight caught her face, illuminating the intelligence in her eyes and the sad set of her mouth. The elder taught me that those who cannot sleep are those who see too much. The eyes stay open in dreams because they have witnessed things the mind cannot forget. Elias pulled on his boots, the leather stiff from the cold night. The elder sounds like a wise man. He is dying, Kalyan said simply, without emotion, though Elias caught the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the firewood. His body is failing. He has perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3. He wanted us settled before he passes. He did not want to leave this world knowing we had nowhere to go. The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like morning fog. Elias moved to the window and looked out at his small ranch as the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple. Everything looked different now. The corral that had held only his 3 horses now seemed inadequate. The well that had served one man would need to work harder. The land that had been his refuge now felt like a responsibility, a living thing that demanded attention and care. Behind him, he heard the other 2 women stirring. Naalnish rose silently, immediately alert, her eyes scanning the room before she fully stood. She had slept in her clothes, Elias noticed, and her knife had remained within arm's reach all night. A warrior's habits died hard, carved into the body through years of training and survival. She stretched with economical movements, checking her range of motion, testing her body the way a soldier might inspect a weapon before battle. Ashki woke last slowly and reluctantly, curling into herself before finally sitting up. In the growing light, Elias could see her more clearly than he had yesterday. She was young, perhaps even younger than 19, with a face that had not yet lost all its childhood softness, despite the hardness of her life. But her eyes were old, carrying a sadness that no teenager should know. She moved with the awkward self-consciousness of someone who had never felt comfortable in their own body, hunching her shoulders as if she could somehow make herself smaller, less visible, less of a burden to the world around her. Kalyan had beans soaking from the night before. She added them to a pot with some of the herbs she had gathered, along with dried meat from Elias's meager stores. The smell of cooking food filled the cabin, rich and earthy, and Elias realized it was the first time in over a year that he had woken to someone else preparing a meal. The scent alone was enough to stir something in his chest, a reminder of domesticity he thought he had left behind forever when his wife and daughter died. They ate in near silence, seated around the small table that was far too small for 4 people. Elbows bumped, knees knocked together. The space that had been perfectly adequate for one solitary man now felt cramped and intimate. Ashki ate quickly, hunched over her bowl as if expecting someone to take it away, her eyes darting nervously between the others. Naalnish ate with steady efficiency, her eyes constantly moving, watching the windows, the door, the spaces between things where danger might hide. Kalyan ate slowly, thoughtfully, occasionally glancing at Elias as if measuring his reactions to their presence, cataloging every small gesture and expression. After breakfast, the work began. Elias had let the ranch fall into serious disrepair over the past months, his depression and isolation making it hard to care about fence posts and roof shingles and all the small maintenance tasks that kept a property functional. But now, with 3 extra pairs of hands and 3 sets of eyes to witness his neglect, the disrepair became obvious and embarrassing. Naalnish surveyed the property with a tactical eye, walking the perimeter with the focus of someone assessing defensive positions. "Your fence is weak," she stated bluntly. "A strong wind could knock it down. Animals could break through easily, men even easier." "I know," Elias admitted, feeling heat rise to his face. "I've been meaning to fix it." "We will fix it today," Naalnish stated, not asking permission but simply declaring reality. She turned to Ashki, her voice sharp but not unkind. "You, come. We need to pull posts and reset them properly. Your strength will be useful." Ashki followed obediently, and Elias watched in genuine amazement as the youngest woman lifted fence posts that would have required 2 grown men to move. Her strength was astonishing, her tall frame providing leverage that made heavy labor look effortless. But she worked with her head down her shoulders, hunched as if apologizing for her own capability, as if her strength was something shameful rather than valuable. Kalyan stayed near the cabin, organizing the interior with quiet efficiency. She moved Elias's sparse belongings with care, touching each item as if it might break, creating spaces that could accommodate 4 people instead of 1. She never threw anything away or altered anything without asking first, but somehow the cabin became more livable under her attention. She found places for things Elias had left scattered. She created order from chaos with the practiced hand of someone who understood that physical order could sometimes impose a sense of mental calm. Elias worked alongside Nyalnish and Ashki, his hands blistering from work he had avoided for too long. The women were right. What would have taken him days, perhaps weeks, to accomplish alone, they completed in hours. But the work was not silent. As they labored under the climbing sun, Nyalnish asked questions, probing questions, dangerous questions. "How long have you lived here?" "Almost a year," Elias answered, hammering a nail into a fresh board with more force than necessary. "And before that?" "Army, 6th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Apache." Nalnish's hands paused briefly in their work. When she spoke again, her voice carried an edge sharp as broken glass. "Fort Apache. You were there during the Troubles." It was not a question. Elias met her gaze and saw something dangerous swimming in her eyes, something that spoke of personal loss and carefully controlled rage. "I was a surgeon. I treated wounded soldiers." "Only soldiers?" The question was sharp-pointed, a blade testing for weakness. Elias thought about lying, thought about evasion and half-truths, and all the ways he had learned to avoid uncomfortable revelations. But something in Nalnish's stare demanded truth, absolute and unvarnished. "No, not only soldiers. Sometimes I treated Apache prisoners. Tried to anyway. The Army did not always allow it. Sometimes they forbade it entirely." "But you tried," Nalnish said, echoing Kalyan's words from the previous night. "Even when forbidden, even when it could have gotten you court-martialed." "Yes." "Why?" Elias set down his hammer and looked at her directly. "Because a wounded person is just a wounded person. The uniform does not matter when someone is bleeding to death. The color of their skin does not matter. Their tribe does not matter. Only the wound matters, and whether you have the skill to close it." Nalnish studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception. Finally she nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was simply acknowledgement, a recognition that he had answered honestly and that honesty at least deserved respect. She returned to her work and the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. But Elias noticed that Ashki had been listening to every word, and when he caught her eye she did not look away as quickly as before. There was something in her expression that might have been the very beginning of trust, fragile as spider silk, but present nonetheless. By midday the temperature had climbed into the 80s, and they paused for water and rest. Elias drew buckets from the well, the rope rough against his palms, while Kalyan brought out bread she had baked in his small oven. It was hard bread meant for traveling and designed to last, but still better than anything Elias had made for himself in months. She had somehow coaxed flavor from his limited ingredients, adding herbs that gave the bread an earthy richness he had not tasted since leaving civilization. They sat in the shade of the barn, and for the first time something resembling ease settled over the group. Nalnish leaned against the barn wall, her eyes half closed but still alert, her body positioned so she could see both approaches to the ranch. Kalyan sat with her legs crossed, sorting through more herbs she had collected, her long fingers moving with the precision of someone who had studied plants their entire life. Ashki sat apart from the others, but not as far as she might have yesterday, her back against a fence post and her face turned toward the sun. "Tell me about Fort Thomas," Kalyan said, suddenly breaking the comfortable silence. "The town where you defended the elder. What are the people like?" Elias considered his answer carefully, knowing that honesty was necessary, but wanting to avoid unnecessary fear. "Suspicious, territorial. Most of them are miners or failed ranchers. They came west looking for something better and found only hard work and harder luck. They do not trust outsiders, and they especially do not trust Apache. Too many skirmishes, too many stories passed down about raids and counter-raids. Fear breeds on itself, until it becomes the only truth people know. "Will they come here?" Naalnish asked, her eyes opening fully, all pretense of rest abandoned. "Eventually. Word spreads fast in small towns where nothing much happens. Someone will have seen you arrive. Someone always sees. They will be curious, and curiosity in places like Fort Thomas can be dangerous." "Curious or hostile?" Kalyan pressed her hands, stilling in their sorting. "Both," Elias admitted. "Fear makes people cruel, and you are frightening to people who are not used to seeing anyone different. Your size alone will terrify them. Add your heritage and the fear multiplies. People fear what they cannot understand, and they destroy what they fear." Ashki spoke for the first time that morning, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the still air. "We are always frightening, even to our own people. Perhaps especially to our own people." Kalyan reached over and squeezed Ashki's hand, her large fingers gentle despite their size. "Not to everyone. The elder was not afraid of us. He saw us as we are, not as legends or omens. The elder is one man," Ashki replied sadly, pulling her hand away to wrap her arms around her knees. "And he is dying. When he is gone, who else will see us as human?" The truth of that statement silenced them all. They sat in the shade, four outcasts bound together by circumstance and necessity, and felt the weight of an uncertain future pressing down like the noonday sun. That evening, after more work and a simple dinner of beans and the last of the bread, Elias made a decision. The thought had been forming all day, growing heavier with each hour, and now he knew it could not be avoided any longer. "Tomorrow I need to go back to Fort Thomas. I need more supplies if we are going to feed 4 people instead of 1. Flour, salt, more beans, meat if I can afford it." He paused, knowing what he was about to say would not be well received. "You should come with me." Nalnish's head snapped up, her expression immediately hostile. "Into the town, where everyone will see us. That is madness." "They are going to see you eventually," Elias said calmly, meeting her anger with steady logic. "Better that it happens when I am with you. Better that we control the circumstances rather than waiting for them to come here uninvited and unannounced." "That is a terrible idea," Nalnish stated flatly, her hand moving unconsciously to her knife. "Probably," Elias agreed. "I have had many terrible ideas in my life. This is just one more, but hiding will only make things worse. People fear what they do not understand, and they understand nothing about you right now. If we walk into town openly, if we show them that you are simply people who need supplies like everyone else, maybe it will be less of a shock when the truth settles in." Kalyan considered this, her intelligent eyes moving from Elias to Nalnish and back again. "Or they will attack us in the street. Mobs do not wait for understanding when fear takes hold." "They might," Elias acknowledged, not sugar-coating the danger. "But I do not think they will. Not in daylight. Not with witnesses present. Fort Thomas has problems, serious problems, but it still pretends to have law and order. Sheriff Clayton may be many things, but he will not allow open violence in the middle of town. His authority depends on maintaining at least the appearance of control." "You have too much faith in the law," Nalnish said bitterly, and Elias heard decades of betrayal in those words. "No," Elias replied quietly, remembering Cibecue Creek and all the laws that had been broken there in the name of orders and expediency. "I have seen what happens when law fails. I have seen what men do when they think no one is watching. I am not naive, Nalnish, but I also know that fear feeds on secrecy and grows fat on ignorance. If we hide you, we confirm that you are something to be hidden, something shameful and dangerous. If we walk openly, we challenge that fear directly." The logic was sound, but the risk was real, and everyone at the table knew it. They debated through the rest of dinner, voices rising and falling, arguments circling and returning to the same essential question: was visibility safer than secrecy? Finally, Kalyan raised her hand for silence, and the authority in the gesture was such that even Nalnish quieted immediately. "Elias is right," Kalyan said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "We cannot hide forever. If we are to live here, truly live, and not simply exist in the shadows, we must be seen. We must show them that we are not monsters, not demons, not omens of disaster, just women who need shelter and are willing to work for it." Nalnish looked like she wanted to argue further, her jaw tight with frustration, but she held her tongue. Ashki said nothing, her face pale with fear at the thought of being displayed before the hostile eyes of strangers, of being examined and judged and found wanting once again. As darkness fell and they prepared for sleep, Elias noticed Ashki lingering by the door instead of retiring to bed with the others. She stood there, her tall frame silhouetted against the dying firelight, her hands clasped together nervously, her shoulders hunched in that familiar protective posture. "You should rest," Elias said gently, banking the fire for the night. "Tomorrow will be difficult, and you will need your strength." Ashki did not move. She stood frozen, staring at something only she could see. For a long moment she said nothing, and Elias thought perhaps she had not heard him. Then in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she asked, "Do you think they will hurt us?" The question hung in the air, naked and vulnerable. Elias wanted to lie, wanted to offer false comfort and empty reassurances. But he had never been good at lying, and this young woman deserved better than comfortable falsehoods. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Some might try. Fear makes people do terrible things, things they would never do if they stopped to think. But I will not let them. I will stand between you and anyone who means you harm." "You are one man," Ashki said, her voice cracking slightly. "What can one man do against a town full of people who hate what they do not understand?" It was the same question Elias had asked himself 1,000 times since Sibique Creek. What could one man do? One man who tried to save a life and failed. One man who went against orders and was punished for his mercy. One man who ran away and hid from his guilt in a forgotten corner of Arizona territory. But looking at Ashki now, at this young woman who had been told her entire life that she was cursed, who had lost everything because of how she was born, who carried the weight of her mother's death like a stone around her neck, Elias found an answer he had not known he possessed. "One man can stand," he said simply, "even if he stands alone, even if he fails, even if standing costs him everything. The standing matters, the refusal to run, to hide, to accept injustice as inevitable. That matters." Ashki looked at him with those old, sad eyes, and for the first time since arriving she seemed to really see him, not as a white man, not as a former soldier, but as another broken person trying to find a way to be whole. "The elder said something similar," she whispered. "He said that standing against injustice, even when you know you will lose, is how you keep your humanity. He said that surrender is easy, but standing is what separates people from animals." The elder was a wise man. Elias repeated Kalyan's words from that morning, feeling the truth of them settle in his bones. "He is dying," Ashki said, and a tear rolled down her cheek, catching the firelight as it fell. "And we were not there to say goodbye. We will never see him again. He sent us away to save us, and now he will die alone." The grief in her voice was raw and genuine, unfiltered by pride or stoicism, and Elias felt it resonate with his own losses like a tuning fork struck in sympathy. He thought about his wife and daughter dead from fever while he was away at war, buried in graves he had never visited. He thought about never getting to say goodbye, never getting to tell them he loved them one last time, never getting to ask forgiveness for all the ways he had failed them. "Come sit," he said gently, gesturing to the chair by the fire. Ashki hesitated, then moved to the chair with the uncertain steps of someone not used to being offered kindness. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, making herself as small as possible, an impossible task for someone her size, but a gesture that spoke volumes about how she saw herself. Elias poured her water from the pitcher Kalyan had filled earlier, the simple act of hospitality, feeling strange after so long alone. "Tell me about the elder. What was he like when you first met him?" And Ashki slowly, haltingly began to talk. The words came hard at first, forced through years of learned silence and self-protection. But gradually, as Elias listened without judgment or interruption, the story began to flow. She spoke about how Noel E. had found her after her family was driven away from their camp, a 10-year-old girl wandering the desert alone, already too tall, already marked as different. She spoke about how he had taken her in despite the protests of the tribe, how he had argued with the council for hours, threatening to leave himself if they would not shelter an orphaned child. She spoke about his kindness, his patience, his refusal to see her as anything other than a child who needed protection and guidance. She spoke about the lessons he had taught her, how to read tracks in sand and stone, how to identify plants by their leaves and roots, how to find water in the desert, how to survive when the world wanted you dead. And she spoke about the nights when she had cried herself to sleep, convinced she was a curse, and how he would sit beside her and tell her stories. Stories about heroes who were different, who were cast out, but who found their purpose anyway. Stories about strength that came not from fitting in, but from standing apart. As she talked, the other women emerged from the bedroom area, drawn by the sound of Ashki's voice, speaking freely for perhaps the first time since they arrived. Kalyan and Nalnish sat near the fire, and soon all four of them were sharing stories about the elder. Kalyan spoke about how Noli had delivered her from her mother's dead body, how he had breathed life into her lungs when she was born blue, and still how he had named her Kalyan, which meant she who was brought back. She spoke about growing up knowing her mother had died to give her life, and how the elder had helped her carry that burden without letting it crush her. Nalnish surprisingly spoke about her husband, about how Noli had performed their marriage ceremony even when the tribe protested, even when they said a giant woman would bring a curse on any man foolish enough to take her as a wife. She spoke about how the elder had stood beside them when the mob came with torches, how he had tried to stop them, how he had held her back when her husband died so that she would not throw her life away on pointless revenge. For the first time since they arrived, the cabin filled with something other than tension and uncertainty. It filled with memory, with shared loss, with the bittersweet comfort of honoring someone who had mattered deeply to all of them. The fire burned low as they talked, shadows dancing on the walls, and the small space felt less like a refuge and more like a home. When the stories finally wound down and exhaustion claimed them, when the fire had burned to embers and the night pressed close around the cabin, Elias lay on his blanket and listened to the sound of 3 women settling into sleep. But tonight was different. Tonight he heard the occasional whisper of comfort, the rustle of one person reaching for another in the darkness, the quiet solidarity of shared grief. He heard Ashki's breathing slow and steady. For the first time heard the absence of the small, frightened sounds she had made the previous night. He heard Kalyan humming something soft and wordless, a lullaby perhaps, or a prayer. He heard even Nalnish relax her warrior's vigilance, easing just slightly in the security of numbers. Elias thought about tomorrow, about walking into Fort Thomas with 3 giant Apache women at his side, about the stares, the whispers, the potential violence. He thought about Sheriff Clayton and the miners and all the people who would see these women as threats rather than refugees. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elias noticed Ashki was missing from the bed. He found her sitting by the creek behind the cabin, her knees drawn to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. He approached slowly. "May I sit?" She nodded, not looking at him. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the water. Finally Ashki spoke. "I killed my mother. Not with my hands, but by existing. I was too large. The midwife told my father I tore her apart coming into this world." "That was not your fault," Elias said gently. "Everyone says that. But they also avoid me. They look at me and see the girl who killed her mother." She wiped her eyes. "I have tried to make myself smaller. I have tried to disappear, but I cannot shrink. I cannot undo what I am." Elias thought of his own daughter who had died while he was away. "I was not there when my child died. I was saving strangers while my own family needed me. For a year I have told myself it was duty, but it was cowardice. I ran from the pain of being there." Ashki looked at him for the first time. "You think I am running?" "No. I think you are standing still waiting for permission to exist. But you do not need permission. You only need to decide that your life has value regardless of how it began." She was quiet, then whispered, "How do I decide that?" "You start by standing up straight, by lifting your head, by taking up the space you were born to fill." He stood and offered his hand. "Come, stand with me." Ashki hesitated, then took his hand and rose. She stood at her full height for the first time in his presence, towering over him. "There," Elias said. "Now you look like someone worth knowing." For the first time since arriving, Ashki smiled. He thought about Ashki's question, "What can one man do against a town?" And he thought about his answer. One man can stand. It would have to be enough. It was all he had to offer. Outside, the desert night breathed its cold air across the land. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama. A coyote called in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. And in a small cabin on the edge of nowhere, 4 people who had been cast out by the world they knew prepared to face that world again. Not with weapons, though. Nalnish's knife remained close. Not with anger, though all of them had reason enough for rage. But with the simple radical act of refusing to hide, of insisting on their right to exist in the light rather than the shadows. Elias did not sleep easily that night. His mind churned with possibilities, with fears, with memories of other times he had stood against the crowd and paid the price. But when he did finally sleep, his dreams were different than usual. He did not dream of Sibique Creek, of blood in the sand and screams in the desert air. He did not dream of Desba's knife entering his chest or her whispered thanks as she died. Instead, he dreamed of standing in the street of Fort Thomas while the whole town watched. He dreamed of holding his ground while others backed away. He dreamed of being seen, truly seen, not as a coward or a traitor or a broken man, but as someone who had chosen to stand when standing mattered. And in the dream, he did not run. When morning came, when the sun broke over the White River Basin and painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, Elias Thorne rose from his blanket a different man than he had been 3 days before. He was still haunted by the ghosts of Sibique Creek, still guilty for the lives he had failed to save, still carrying the weight of his failures like stones in his pockets. But he was no longer alone in carrying them, and that he was beginning to understand made all the difference in the world. The day of reckoning was coming. The town would have its say. The people of Fort Thomas would react as people always do when confronted with the unfamiliar and the frightening. But Elias and his unlikely household would face it together, standing side by side, refusing to hide what they were or apologize for existing. Whatever came next, they would not face it cowering in the shadows. They would face it standing in the light, visible and vulnerable and utterly unashamed. And if that was not courage, Elias thought, as he watched the sun climb higher, then courage was not worth having. The journey to Fort Thomas began at first light. Elias had saddled patience before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The familiar routine of checking cinches and adjusting stirrups, helping to calm the anxiety building in his chest. The 3 women stood in the yard, their bundles packed with items to trade, their faces set with varying degrees of apprehension. Naalnish wore her determination like armor, her jaw set and her eyes hard. She had dressed in her best clothing, a deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light, but she had also strapped a knife to her thigh where it could be easily reached. Kalyan had braided her hair with silver ornaments that chimed softly when she moved, a deliberate choice to appear as a person of substance rather than a beggar seeking charity. Ashki had tried to make herself presentable, but her hands shook as she adjusted her clothing, and her eyes kept darting toward the horizon as if calculating escape routes. "We walk," Nalnish announced. "Horses would draw more attention, and we need to control how we are first seen." Elias nodded, understanding the tactical thinking. 4 people on horseback would arrive quickly, giving the town no time to adjust. Walking would allow Fort Thomas to see them coming from a distance, to process their approach, to make the initial shock less immediate. The walk took 2 hours under the climbing sun. They moved in silence, conserving energy and words for what lay ahead. Elias found himself watching the women as they traveled, noticing things he had missed in the close confines of the cabin. Naalnish walked like a scout, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape, her body positioned to react to threats from any direction. Every few minutes she would pause, almost imperceptibly testing the wind, listening to sounds Elias could not hear. Once she held up a hand and they all stopped while she studied something in the distance that turned out to be nothing more than a dust devil spinning across the desert floor. But her caution was not paranoia. It was survival. Kalyan moved with the grace of someone who had learned to be conscious of every step, every gesture. She never stumbled, never made unnecessary noise, never drew attention through clumsiness. Elias realized she had spent her entire life trying to minimize her presence, to take up less space than her body demanded, to become as invisible as someone her size could possibly be. Ashki struggled. Her long legs were built for covering ground quickly, but she had never learned to be comfortable with her stride. She walked with her shoulders hunched, her head down, trying to make herself smaller with every step. Several times she nearly tripped over her own feet, and each time her face flushed with shame, as if her awkwardness was a personal failing rather than simple unfamiliarity with her own body. When Fort Thomas came into view, a collection of wooden buildings shimmering in the heat haze, Elias felt his stomach tighten. They crested the final rise, and the town spread before them, and he saw the moment when people began to notice their approach. A woman hanging laundry on a line behind the general store stopped mid-motion, her hands frozen on a wet shirt, her mouth falling open. A man leading a mule toward the blacksmith shop halted in the middle of the street, staring. Two children playing in the dust scrambled to their feet and ran toward their mother, who scooped them up and retreated into a doorway. The effect rippled through Fort Thomas like a stone dropped in still water. Work stopped. Conversations died. People emerged from buildings to stare at the sight that should not exist: three impossibly tall Apache women walking calmly into town beside Elias Thorne. "Keep walking," Elias said quietly. Eyes forward. "Do not react to anything they say or do unless I tell you otherwise." They entered the main street, their footsteps loud in the sudden silence. Elias could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on them, could sense the fear and confusion radiating from the townspeople like heat from sun-baked stone. He kept his hand away from his revolver, kept his posture relaxed and non-threatening, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The blacksmith, a massive German named Muller, stood in the doorway of his shop with his hammer hanging loose in one hand. His eyes went wide as they approached, tracking from one woman to the next as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "Mein Gott," he whispered and crossed himself. They passed the saloon, and Elias heard the scrape of chairs as men inside crowded to the windows. Someone laughed, a nervous sound quickly cut off. Someone else swore in disbelief. The bat-wing doors swung open and three men stumbled out onto the porch, drunk despite the early hour, their faces slack with shock. One of them, a thin ranch hand with a scar across his cheek, pointed with an unsteady hand. "What in the hell are those people?" Elias said firmly, not breaking stride. "They are people same as you and me. Mind your manners." "People?" The ranch hand laughed again, the sound ugly and afraid. "Ain't no people that size. They're freaks. Monsters." Nalnish's hand moved toward her knife, but Kalyan touched her arm gently, a silent plea for restraint. Ashki hunched her shoulders even more, trying to disappear, her face burning with shame. Elias stopped and turned to face the ranch hand directly. "Say that again, and we will have a problem." The man blinked at him, alcohol and bravado warring with self-preservation. His friends pulled him back toward the saloon, muttering warnings. The confrontation ended before it could escalate, but Elias knew the damage was done. The word would spread. Monsters. Freaks. Things that should not exist. They continued toward the general store, and Elias saw Mr. Brennan standing on the porch, his expression carefully neutral. The old shopkeeper watched their approach with sharp eyes, taking in every detail, making calculations that Elias could not read. "Mr. Thorne," Brennan said as they reached the steps, "I see you have brought company today." "I have guests staying at my ranch," Elias replied evenly. "We need supplies. Flour, salt, beans, and coffee if you have it fresh." Brennan's eyes moved from Elias to the three women and back again. For a long moment the shopkeeper said nothing, and Elias felt the silence stretch tight. Then Brennan nodded slowly and stepped aside. "Come in, then. Let us see what we can do for you." It was such a simple gesture, such a small act of normalcy, but Elias felt tension drain from his shoulders. Brennan was not refusing service. He was treating them like customers, like people, and in Fort Thomas that was more than Elias had dared hope for. They entered the dim interior of the store, the smell of leather and tobacco and dried goods wrapping around them. The space that had seemed adequate when Elias shopped alone now felt cramped with 4 people inside. Naelnish had to duck to avoid hitting her head on a hanging lantern. Kalyan moved carefully between the shelves, conscious of her size, while Ashki stayed close to the door as if ready to flee. Brennan moved behind his counter, pulling out his ledger. "How much flour?" "2 sacks, Elias said. 3 if the price is fair." "Same price as always," Brennan replied, writing in his book. "Salt, 10 pounds. They continued through the list, Brennan noting each item with the same professional courtesy he had always shown Elias. But the shopkeeper's eyes kept drifting to the women, studying them with an intensity that made Elias nervous. Finally, as Brennan calculated the total, he spoke. "I do not suppose you would like to tell me what is really happening here, Thorne?" Elias met his gaze. "They needed a place to stay. I had room. That is all there is to it." "That is not all," Brennan said quietly. "The whole town is going to want explanations, and some of them are not going to be satisfied with 'they needed a place to stay.' Then some of them will have to learn to live with disappointment." Brennan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Your business is your own. But I will tell you something, Thorne. Sheriff Clayton was in here yesterday. He was asking about you, about whether you had been acting strange, about whether you had mentioned anything about Apache visitors." Elias felt ice form in his stomach. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you keep to yourself, and I do not pry into customers' affairs," Brennan replied. "But he is watching you now. He has been watching since that business in the street with the old Apache man. Clayton does not like mysteries, and he especially does not like anything that might upset the fragile peace we have with the tribes." Kalyan spoke for the first time since entering the store, her voice low and controlled. "The sheriff fears us because we are evidence." Brennan's head snapped toward her, surprise clear on his face. "You speak English?" "I speak several languages," Kalyan replied calmly, "and I understand what men fear. The sheriff fears us because our existence raises questions. Questions about where we came from. Questions about what happened to our families. Questions he does not want answered." "What kind of questions?" Brennan asked, leaning forward despite himself. "The kind that involve unmarked graves and official reports that do not match reality," Kalyan said. "The kind that could end careers or start investigations. We are not just unusual, Mr. Brennan. We are inconvenient." Before Brennan could respond, the door to the shop opened and sunlight flooded in along with a new presence. Elias turned to see Sheriff Luther Clayton standing in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the exit, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Clayton was 50 years old, with a face carved from weathered leather and eyes like chips of flint. He had been sheriff of Fort Thomas for 15 years, maintaining order through a combination of harsh justice and strategic blindness to certain activities. Elias had always found him competent but cold, a man who enforced the law without necessarily believing in it. Now, looking at Clayton's face as the sheriff studied the 3 Apache women, Elias saw something else. Fear. Deep, visceral fear barely contained beneath a mask of official authority. "Thorne," Clayton said, his voice flat, "I need a word with you. Outside." "I am in the middle of purchasing supplies," Elias replied, keeping his tone neutral. It was not a request. The air in the store grew thick with tension. Naelnish shifted her weight, preparing for violence. Kalyan placed a warning hand on her arm. Ashki pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible. Elias made a decision. "Ladies, wait here with Mr. Brennan. I will return shortly." He walked toward Clayton, who stepped aside to let him pass. As Elias moved through the doorway, the sheriff's eyes never left the 3 women, and Elias saw his hand tighten on his revolver. Outside, the street had filled with onlookers. Townspeople stood in clusters watching the general store with the morbid fascination of people witnessing something unprecedented. Elias saw miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, even the town doctor standing on his porch with his arms crossed. Clayton led Elias away from the store toward the sheriff's office. Once they were out of immediate earshot, the sheriff stopped and turned his face tight with barely controlled emotion. "What the hell do you think you are doing, Thorne?" "Buying supplies for my household," Elias said calmly. "Do not play games with me," Clayton hissed. 3 Apache women, giants, living on your property. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble this is going to cause? They are people seeking refuge. I provided it. I was not aware that hospitality had become illegal. Clayton's eyes narrowed. Where did they come from? Which tribe? What are their names? That is none of your concern. Everything in this town is my concern, Clayton said, his voice rising, especially when it involves Apache during a time of tension between the army and the tribes. You are creating a situation that could explode into violence. The only violence I have witnessed, Elias said coldly, was the drunk in the street calling them monsters. Perhaps you should direct your law enforcement efforts toward people making threats rather than people seeking shelter. Clayton stepped closer, his face inches from Elias's. Listen to me very carefully. Those women are not normal. They are not just Apache. They are something else, something wrong. People are going to be afraid, and fear makes people do stupid things. I am trying to prevent bloodshed here. Then perhaps, Elias said, meeting the sheriff's glare without flinching, you should tell people there is nothing to fear. You are the law. What you say carries weight. Tell them these are women under my protection, and anyone who harms them will answer to the law. For a moment Clayton said nothing. Then he laughed a bitter sound without humor. You think I can control what 300 scared people might do? You think my badge means anything if the whole town decides those women are a threat? It should, Elias replied. If it does not, then what is the point of wearing it? Clayton's jaw worked silently for a moment. You are making a mistake, Thorne. A bad one. And when it all falls apart, when people start dying, that blood will be on your hands. It will not be the first blood on my hands, Elias said quietly. But at least this time, it will be from trying to save lives instead of taking them. Something flickered across Clayton's face at those words. Recognition, understanding, and beneath it all that same deep fear Elias had seen in the store. The sheriff stepped back, adjusting his gun belt. Finish your business and get out of town. And Thorne, do not bring them back here, for their sake and yours. Clayton walked away, leaving Elias standing in the dusty street. Around him the townspeople watched and whispered. Elias felt their stares like physical weight, felt their fear and confusion pressing down. He returned to the general store where the 3 women waited with Brennan. The shopkeeper had finished totaling their purchases and had the supplies ready. No charge for the coffee, Brennan said quietly as Elias paid. Call it a welcome gift. Elias met the old man's eyes and saw kindness there and unexpected solidarity. Thank you. They loaded the supplies and prepared to leave. As they stepped back onto the street, Elias saw that more people had gathered. The crowd had grown drawn by curiosity and fear. They stood in silent clusters, watching, judging, afraid. Naalnish held her head high, her eyes challenging anyone to speak. Kalyan walked with quiet dignity, her face serene despite the hostile stares. Ashki trembled but did not hide, forcing herself to be visible, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. They walked through Fort Thomas in silence, and the town watched them go. As they crested the rise and the buildings fell away behind them, Ashki finally spoke. They hate us. No, Kalyan replied gently. They fear us. Hate comes later if we let it. And if we do not let it? Ashki asked. Elias thought about Sheriff Clayton's fear about the way the whole town had reacted to something they could not understand. He thought about the long road ahead, about all the battles yet to come. Then we teach them, he said. We show them that different is not the same as dangerous. We give them time to see us as we are. And if they do not learn? Nalnish asked. Elias touched the revolver at his hip. Then we protect ourselves, but we try peace first. We always try peace first. They walked back toward the ranch in silence, carrying their supplies and the weight of hostile stares. Behind them, Fort Thomas buzzed with speculation and fear. The seed had been planted. Now they would see what grew from it. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Elias and the 3 women fell into a rhythm of work and watchfulness, their days filled with the endless tasks of maintaining the ranch, while their nights were spent taking turns at guard duty. Nalnish had insisted on the precaution, and Elias had not argued. They all knew that Fort Thomas would not simply accept their presence and move on. The question was not if trouble would come, but when. On the 4th morning, Elias woke before dawn to find Kalyan already up, standing at the window with her arms wrapped around herself. Something in her posture spoke of distress, and he rose quietly from his blanket. "What is wrong?" She turned, and he saw tears on her face, catching the first gray light of dawn. "The elder is dead. I know it. I felt it in my dreams. He came to me and said goodbye." Elias wanted to dismiss it as anxiety, as the natural fear of someone waiting for inevitable news. But something in Kalyan's certainty stopped him. When, last night, near midnight, he went peacefully surrounded by those who loved him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He told me we made the right choice coming here. He told me to trust you." Before Elias could respond, Nalnish emerged from the bedroom fully dressed and armed despite the early hour. "Someone is coming. Multiple riders, from the east." They moved quickly, years of survival instinct taking over. Ashki stumbled out, still half asleep, but she grabbed the heavy staff they had fashioned for her and positioned herself near the door. Kalyan dried her tears and became focused, her grief set aside for the more immediate need of survival. Elias checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded, then moved to the window beside Nalnish. In the growing light he could see dust rising from the direction of Fort Thomas. Not 2 riders this time. More. Many more. "How many?" he asked. Nalnish's eyes were sharper than his. 6, no 7, riding hard. They will be here in 10 minutes. "It might not be hostile," Elias said, though he did not believe it. "It is always hostile," Nalnish replied flatly. Kalyan joined them at the window. "These are not the same men from town. Look at how they ride. These are not drunk miners or angry shopkeepers. These are soldiers." She was right. Even from a distance, Elias could see the disciplined formation, the way they moved together as a unit. Former cavalry, most likely, men who had served under the flag and learned to fight as a coordinated force. "Sheriff Clayton," Elias said, understanding flooding through him. "He called in reinforcements, men he knew from his army days." The riders drew closer, and details became clear. 7 men, all armed with rifles in addition to sidearms. They wore civilian clothes, but their bearing was military. At their head rode Sheriff Clayton, his face set in grim determination. They reined up 50 yards from the cabin, forming a line that spoke of tactical planning. This was not a mob driven by fear and alcohol. This was an organized force with a specific purpose. Clayton called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Thorne, we need to talk." Elias stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting near his revolver but not touching it. "Then talk. No need to bring an army for conversation." "This is not a conversation I want to have in front of them," Clayton said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Send them outside where I can see them." "They stay where they are," Elias replied. "You want to talk to me, you talk to me. Their presence is not required." Clayton's jaw tightened. "I am trying to do this the civilized way, Thorne. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. You brought 7 armed men to my property at dawn. That is not civilized. That is intimidation." One of the men beside Clayton, a thick-shouldered brute with a military mustache, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Told you he would not listen to reason, Sheriff. Man who takes in Apache savages is not interested in being reasonable." "Quiet, Morrison," Clayton snapped. He turned back to Elias. "Here is how this is going to work. Those 3 women are coming with us. We are taking them to Fort Apache, where they will be properly registered with the Indian agent. They will be placed under military supervision until their tribal affiliation can be determined and they can be returned to their people." "They have no people," Elias said. "They were cast out, sent away. I am their shelter now." "You are harboring fugitives," Clayton countered. "Apache who have left their designated reservation without permission. That is a federal crime, Thorne. I can arrest you right now for aiding and abetting." "They were never on a reservation. They have committed no crime except being born different." Morrison laughed the sound ugly. "Different. That is what you call it. Those are not natural women, Thorne. Something is wrong with them. Could be a disease. Could be they are cursed like their people say. Either way, they cannot be allowed to roam free." Inside the cabin, Elias heard movement. The door opened and Nalnish stepped out onto the porch, her full height on display. The effect on the mounted men was immediate. Horses shied, hands moved to weapons. Morrison's mouth fell open. "I am Nalnish," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have committed no crime. I have harmed no one. I have left no reservation because I was never allowed to live on one. My own people drove me away because they feared what I represent. Now you would drive me away for the same reason. Where exactly am I supposed to go?" Clayton stared at her, and Elias saw that fear again. The sheriff's hand trembled slightly on his reins. "That is not my problem. My job is to maintain order in Fort Thomas and the surrounding territory. Your presence here threatens that order." Kalyan emerged next, moving to stand beside Nalnish. "We threaten nothing except your comfort. Our existence raises questions you do not want asked, about what happened to our families, about the massacres that went unreported, about the children who disappeared from their tribes and were never accounted for." "I do not know what you are talking about," Clayton said, but his voice had gone tight. "Yes, you do," Kalyan said softly. "You were at Sibecue Creek. You were there when they killed my mother and the others. You were there when they burned the bodies and wrote in the official report that no women or children were present. But they were present, Sheriff. We are the proof of their existence. We are the evidence that survived." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold still. The other men looked at Clayton with new understanding, with shock and dawning comprehension. Morrison broke the silence. "Is that true, Luther? Were there women and children at Sibecue?" "That is classified military information," Clayton said, his voice hoarse. "That means yes," another rider said, a younger man with corporal stripes faded on his sleeve. "Jesus Christ, Luther, if word gets out that we covered up civilian casualties, that we killed women, there will be investigations, courts-martial, prison. Which is exactly why these 3 cannot be allowed to speak freely." Clayton said, his hand moving to his revolver. "They are a threat to every man who served at Sibecue, every man who followed orders and did what needed to be done to pacify hostile territory." Elias felt his blood turn to ice. "You brought these men here to kill them. This was never about registration or reservations. You brought a firing squad." "I brought men who understand what is at stake," Clayton said. "Men who know that sometimes hard decisions have to be made for the greater good." "There were children," Kalyan said, her voice breaking. "Babies. The soldiers shot babies and then burned the evidence, and you call that the greater good?" "I call it war," Clayton said harshly. "War is ugly. War demands ugly choices. We did what we had to do to prevent future attacks to save American lives." "You murdered children," Nalnish said, and her hand moved to her knife. "And now you come to murder us to hide your crime." "Not murder," Clayton said. "Justice. You are hostile Apache harbored by a civilian in violation of federal law. We have every right to use force to apprehend you, and if you resist, well, that is unfortunate but necessary." Elias drew his revolver in one smooth motion, the barrel leveling at Clayton's chest. "You are not touching them." Every gun in the line of riders came up, 7 rifles pointed at the porch. The odds were impossible. 7 trained marksmen against 1 aging surgeon with a handgun. Elias knew he could maybe kill Clayton, maybe get one more shot off before they cut him down. But the women would die regardless. Then Ashkey stepped out onto the porch. She had been so quiet, so invisible despite her size that her appearance shocked everyone. She was the tallest of the three, towering over even Nilnish, and she held the heavy oak staff in both hands like a weapon. Her face was no longer hunched with shame. For the first time since Elias had met her, Ashkey stood at her full height, shoulders back, chin raised. "You want to kill us because we remind you of your sins," she said, and her voice did not tremble. "You want to erase us because we are living proof that you are not heroes but murderers. You tell yourselves that war made you do terrible things, but war does not make anyone do anything. War reveals what people truly are. And you are cowards who kill children and then hide behind uniforms and orders." Morrison raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger. "Shut your mouth, savage." "Make me," Ashkey said, and she took a step forward. "You have guns. I have a stick. But I am not afraid of you. I have spent my entire life being afraid. Afraid of my own people. Afraid of my own body. Afraid of existing. But I'm not afraid anymore. If you're going to kill me, then do it. But do it knowing that I see you for what you are. Not soldiers, not lawmen, just small, frightened men trying to cover up the worst thing they ever did." The young corporal lowered his rifle. "I cannot do this. Luther the First signed up to fight warriors, not execute women." "Raise that rifle, Daniels," Clayton ordered. "No, sir. This is wrong. This is murder, plain and simple." Two other men lowered their weapons, doubt clear on their faces. Morrison and the remaining riders kept their aim steady, but the unity had been broken. Clayton's face flushed red. "You are all going to hang for this, for disobeying orders, for letting enemy combatants escape." "They are not combatants," Daniel said. "They are victims. Victims of something we did. Maybe we cannot change what happened at Sibicu, but we do not have to make it worse." "They will talk," Clayton hissed. "They will tell everyone what happened. Our careers will be destroyed. Our lives will be over." "Maybe they should be," Daniel said quietly. He holstered his weapon and turned his horse. "I want no part of this. I did terrible things in the war, things that haunt me. But I will not add this to my conscience." He rode away, and after a moment the two men who had lowered their weapons followed. That left Clayton Morrison and two others. 4 guns still pointed at the porch. Still impossible odds. But something had changed. The certainty was gone. The righteousness had cracked. Elias kept his revolver steady. "It is over, Clayton. Even if you kill us all right now, those 3 men will talk. The truth will come out. You cannot murder everyone who knows." "I can try," Clayton said, and his finger tightened on the trigger. The shot, when it came, did not come from Clayton. It came from the ridge behind the cabin, a rifle crack that echoed across the desert. Dust kicked up at Morrison's horse's feet, and the animal reared, throwing its rider. Another shot, and the man next to Clayton jerked as his hat flew off his head, the bullet passing within inches of his skull. On the ridge a figure stood outlined against the rising sun. Then another. Then 3 more. Apache warriors' rifles raised, positioned with clear lines of fire. The youngest of them called out in English, his voice carrying clearly, "The elder Noli is dead. We come to honor his final wish. These women are under our protection. Any who harm them will face our justice." Elias recognized the voice. Kuruk, the boy who had warned them days ago. But he was not alone. The warriors with him were tribal leaders, men whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Clayton's horse danced nervously, sensing its rider's panic. The sheriff's gun wavered, no longer pointing at Elias, but not lowered either. "You are declaring war over 3 outcasts." "We are declaring that the elder was right," Kuruk called back. "For too long we have let fear drive us to cruelty. We have treated those who are different as cursed when they are simply different. The elder said these women deserved protection, not punishment. We failed him in life. We will not fail him in death." Morrison scrambled to his feet, reaching for his rifle. A shot from the ridge sent the weapon spinning from his hands before he could grasp it. "Go," Kuruk said. "Tell your people that these women have sanctuary. Tell them that any who come with violence will be met with violence. The elder bought peace with his sacrifice. We will honor that peace, but we will not tolerate murder." Clayton sat frozen on his horse, his face a mask of impotent rage. He had come with superior numbers and found himself outmaneuvered. He had come to commit murder and found witnesses who would ensure justice. Finally, slowly, he lowered his weapon. "This is not over." "Yes," Elias said quietly. "It is. You lost the moment you chose fear over truth. Go back to Fort Thomas. Tell them whatever story helps you sleep at night. But leave us alone." Clayton turned his horse and his remaining men followed. They rode away at a gallop, dust rising in their wake, defeated not by force of arms, but by the simple refusal of others to participate in their crime. When they were gone, the warriors on the ridge descended. Kuruk reached the cabin first, his young face solemn. He spoke directly to Kalyan in Apache, and she responded in the same language, her voice thick with emotion. Elias caught only fragments, but the meaning was clear. The elder had died peacefully. His final words had been about the women, about giving them a chance at life. The tribal council had debated for hours, but in the end enough had been moved by the elder's sacrifice to offer protection. Kuruk turned to Elias and switched to English. "The elder spoke of you before he died. He said you were a man who tried to heal even when healing was forbidden. He said you understood that mercy is not weakness, but strength." The boy paused, studying Elias with eyes older than his years. "He said we should learn from you if we are wise enough to listen." "I am not a teacher," Elias said. "I am just a man trying to do better than I did before." "That is what makes you worth learning from," Kuruk replied. The warriors did not stay long. They had made their statement, delivered their warning, and honored the elder's memory. As they prepared to leave, the oldest among them approached the three women. He spoke in Apache, his words formal and ceremonial. Kalyan translated for Elias. "He says that we are no longer outcasts. We may return to the tribe if we wish. The council has voted to accept us, to recognize that our differences do not make us cursed." "Will you go?" Elias asked, surprised by the sudden tightness in his chest at the thought of them leaving. The three women looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally Nalnish answered, "The tribe offers acceptance now after years of cruelty, because a dying man shamed them into it. Their mercy comes from guilt, not understanding. They accept us because they must not, because they want to." She looked at Elias directly. "You accepted us because you saw us as people. You stood for us when standing meant facing guns. You asked nothing in return. Where would you have us go?" "I would have you stay," Elias said simply. "If you want to." "We want to," Kalyan said softly. Ashki said nothing, but she moved closer to Elias, and the gesture spoke volumes. The warriors departed, riding back toward their camp. Kuruk was the last to leave, and he paused his horse beside the porch. "The elder was right about one more thing," the boy said. "He said that healing the divide between our peoples would not come from grand gestures or treaties. It would come from small acts of courage by individuals who refused to hate. He said you were one such individual. I think he was right." "The elder was a wise man," Elias said, the phrase now familiar as a prayer. "He was," Kuruk agreed, "and he is missed, but his death was not without purpose. Because of him, these women have a home. Because of him, some of our people have learned to question their fear. That is a worthy legacy." After Kuruk left, the four of them stood on the porch in silence, watching the dust settle. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the ranch in golden light. The crisis had passed, but Elias knew it was not truly over. Clayton would not forget. Fort Thomas would not simply accept this new reality. There would be more challenges, more confrontations. But for now, they had survived. "I need to sit down," Ashki said suddenly, and she sank onto the porch steps with shaking hands. "I thought we were going to die." "We almost did," Nalnish said, but there was approval in her voice. "You stood tall. You spoke truth. You were brave." I was terrified, Ashki admitted. Bravery is not the absence of fear, Kalyan said, sitting beside her. It is acting despite fear. You were very brave today. Elias holstered his revolver and sat on the steps with them. 4 people who had been strangers less than a week ago now bound together by shared danger and shared survival. The elder died last night, Kalyan said quietly. But he gave us a gift before he left. He gave us each other. He gave us a chance. They sat together in the morning sun, exhausted and relieved and grateful to be alive. Around them the desert stretched vast and indifferent, but here on this small ranch 4 outcasts had found something precious. They had found sanctuary. They had found family. And they had found the courage to stand when standing mattered most. The days following the confrontation with Sheriff Clayton passed in a strange, suspended peace. Elias woke each morning half expecting to see riders on the horizon, but the land remained empty, save for the occasional hawk circling overhead. The women moved through their routines with cautious optimism, though Naalnish never strayed far from her weapons, and Kalyan spent long hours watching the approaches to the ranch. Ashki changed most noticeably. She no longer hunched her shoulders when she walked. She carried her height with something approaching pride, and when she worked alongside Elias repairing the barn roof, she no longer apologized for her strength. Instead, she lifted beams that would have required 3 men and set them in place with quiet efficiency. On the 7th day after Clayton's retreat, Elias rode alone to Fort Thomas. The women had wanted to come, but he convinced them that a single visit to gauge the town's mood was wiser than provoking another confrontation. He went at noon when the sun was high, and the streets were busy making any violence more public and therefore less likely. The town that greeted him was different than before. People did not flee at his approach, but neither did they meet his eyes. They watched him from doorways and windows, their faces carefully blank. The hostility had not vanished, but it had gone underground, become hidden, and therefore more dangerous. Mr. Brennan greeted him at the general store with a subtle nod. "Thorne, surprised to see you back so soon." "Need supplies," Elias said, "and information if you are willing to share it." Brennan glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer. "Clayton is telling people you are in league with hostile Apache. Says you are hiding fugitives and threatening federal officers. Half the town believes him. The other half does not know what to believe." "And what do you believe?" The old shopkeeper studied him for a long moment. "I believe that in 40 years of running this store I have learned to judge character. You are not a man who harbors criminals. You are a man who saw people in need and offered help. There is a difference. Tell that to Clayton." "Clayton is scared," Brennan said quietly. "A scared man is a dangerous man. He came back from your ranch looking like he had seen his own grave. Whatever happened out there shook him badly. Now he is trying to regain control the only way he knows how, through intimidation and lies." "Will it work?" Brennan shrugged. "Depends on whether people are more afraid of Apache or more tired of being told what to think. Fort Thomas has had its fill of strong men making decisions for everyone else. Some folks are starting to ask questions." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about what really happened at Cibecue Creek. Questions about why Clayton is so desperate to get rid of 3 women who have done nothing wrong. Questions about whether the stories we have been told about Indian troubles match the reality." Brennan paused. "Your giant women have become a symbol, Thorne. Some see them as proof that Apache are monsters. Others see them as proof that we have been the monsters all along." Elias purchased his supplies and left Brennan's words weighing heavy on his mind. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours, and he spent them thinking about symbols and truth, about fear and courage, about the fine line between safety and cowardice. When he crested the final rise and saw his cabin, he pulled his horse to a sudden stop. The women were not alone. In the yard stood a wagon, and beside it a family. A white family. A man and woman both thin and worn by hard living, and 3 children ranging from perhaps 5 to 12 years old. They stood uncertainly near the porch while Naalnish watched them from the doorway, her hand near her knife but not touching it. Elias spurred his horse forward, his mind racing through possibilities. A trick, a trap, some scheme of Clayton's to get close enough to cause harm. But as he drew nearer, he saw that the family carried no weapons. Their wagon was loaded with belongings, everything they owned packed haphazardly as if they had left in a hurry. The woman held the youngest child against her hip, and her face showed exhaustion and desperation in equal measure. Elias dismounted and approached slowly. "Can I help you folks?" The man stepped forward, removing his hat nervously. "Mr. Thorne, my name is Samuel Garrett. This is my wife, Mary, and our children. We heard about what happened with the sheriff. Heard you stood up to him. Heard you were giving shelter to Apache women that nobody else would take in." "That is true," Elias said carefully. "What of it?" Garrett's wife spoke up, her voice strained. "We need help. We had a homestead 20 miles north of here. Small place, barely making it. Last week some men came. They said they were acting on behalf of a mining company that had rights to the land. They said we had to leave or they would burn us out." "Did you report it to Sheriff Clayton?" "We tried," Garrett said bitterly. "Clayton said it was a civil matter, that we should hire a lawyer." "A lawyer? We cannot afford food half the time. How are we supposed to afford a lawyer?" He twisted his hat in his hands. "We left, packed everything we could carry and started driving. We thought maybe we could find work in Fort Thomas, start over. But when we got there, people told us there was no room, no jobs, no place for more homesteaders." "Then someone mentioned you," Mary Garrett added. "Said you took in people nobody else would. Said you stood up to the sheriff and survived. Said maybe you were the kind of man who would understand what it is like to have nowhere else to go." Elias looked at the 3 children. The oldest, a girl, held her younger sibling's hands and tried to look brave. The middle child, a boy, had bruises on his face that looked fresh. The youngest simply stared with the blank exhaustion of a child who had cried all their tears. Kalyan emerged from the cabin, followed by Ashki. They studied the family with careful eyes. "How did you know to come here specifically?" Kalyan asked, her voice gentle but probing. "Mr. Brennan at the general store," Garrett said. "When we asked about work, he pulled me aside. Said there was a man outside town who might understand desperate circumstances. Said that man had recently taken in 3 Apache women that everyone else wanted gone. Said if that man could show mercy to Apache, he might show mercy to struggling homesteaders too." Elias felt something shift in his chest. Brennan had sent them. The old shopkeeper had seen people in need and directed them here, knowing that Elias had already crossed the line from solitary rancher to something else. Something more dangerous, but also more necessary. A refuge. "We do not have much," Elias began, but Nalnish cut him off. "We have more than they do. We have shelter. We have food. We have space." She looked at Elias directly. "The elder taught us that those who have been shown mercy must show mercy to others. These people need help. We can provide it." "The cabin is small," Elias protested. 7 people already. Now 4 more. 11 people in a space built for 1. "Then we build more," Ashki said, speaking up for the first time. "We are strong. We can expand the cabin, build additional rooms. We have tools and timber in the hills. It will take work, but we can do it." Mary Garrett's eyes filled with tears. "We do not want charity. We can work. Samuel is good with his hands. I can cook and clean. The children can help with chores. We will earn our keep." Elias looked at the family, at his 3 giant women, at the small ranch that had been his solitary refuge for so long. He thought about what he was becoming. A year ago he had come here to hide, to disappear, to live out his days alone with his guilt and his ghosts. Now he was building something else entirely. A household of outcasts. A collection of people that society had rejected, finding safety in numbers and purpose in shared survival. It was terrifying. It was complicated. It was everything he had tried to avoid. But looking at the Garrett children, at their hollow eyes and desperate hope, Elias knew he could not turn them away any more than he could have turned away Kalyan and her companions. "You can stay," he said. "We will figure out the details as we go." Mary Garrett burst into tears, pressing her face against her husband's shoulder. Samuel shook Elias's hand with desperate gratitude. The children simply stared, unable to quite believe that their wandering had ended. That night, 11 people crowded into Elias Thorne's cabin. They ate beans and flatbread that Kalyan had prepared, stretching supplies that had seemed adequate for 4 but were clearly insufficient for 11. They sat shoulder to shoulder, knees touching the cabin filled with warmth and voices and the strange comfort of shared hardship. After dinner, while Mary Garrett settled the children to sleep and Samuel unloaded their wagon, Elias stood on the porch with Kalyan. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like salt on black cloth. "This is going to get complicated," Elias said. "It already is complicated," Kalyan replied. "But complications are not always bad. The elder used to say that simple lives are often empty lives. It is in the complications, the connections, the responsibilities to others that we find meaning." The elder seems to have had an opinion about everything. Kalyan smiled. He did, and he was usually right, which made him insufferable at times. Her smile faded. "I miss him. Every day I wake up and think of something I want to ask him, some piece of wisdom I need. Then I remember he is gone." "He left his wisdom with you," Elias said. "Everything you learned from him, everything he taught you about mercy and strength and standing tall, that did not die with him." "No," Kalyan agreed softly, "but it is lonely carrying it alone." "You are not alone," Elias said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. None of them were alone anymore. They had each other, this strange collection of broken people building something new from their shared brokenness. Kalyan turned to face him fully. In the starlight her face was beautiful, her eyes deep and knowing. "You have changed since we came. The man who barely spoke, who lived like a ghost, that man is disappearing. Someone else is emerging. I do not know who that someone is yet." "A leader," Kalyan said. "Whether you want to be or not. People are coming to you because they see something worth following. They see a man who stands for the forgotten, who offers shelter to the rejected. That is a powerful thing. It is also a dangerous thing. Clayton will not ignore this. Every person who comes here makes us more visible, more vulnerable. Then we become strong enough to defend ourselves," Nayalnish said, emerging from the cabin. "We teach everyone here to shoot, to fight, to protect this place. We turn your small ranch into something that cannot be easily destroyed." "A fortress?" Elias asked. "A home," Nalnish corrected, "but a home worth defending. A home that stands as proof that different people can live together if they choose to see each other as human rather than as threats." Over the following days, the ranch transformed. Samuel Garrett proved skilled with carpentry, and he and Elias began constructing an addition to the cabin. Ashki provided the raw strength needed to raise heavy beams, while Nayalnish used her tactical mind to suggest defensive improvements. Windows were positioned to provide clear sight lines. The door was reinforced. A small watchtower was built onto the barn roof, disguised as a hayloft, but providing a clear view of all approaches. Mary Garrett took over the cooking, freeing Kalyan to focus on gathering medicinal herbs and teaching the children which plants were safe to eat. The oldest Garrett child, whose name was Elizabeth, followed Kalyan everywhere, fascinated by the tall woman's knowledge of healing. The boy Thomas attached himself to Naalnish. At first she was uncomfortable with his attention, unused to children and unsure how to respond. But slowly she began teaching him tracking skills, showing him how to read the desert's subtle signs. He learned quickly, and Elias often saw them walking the perimeter together, the fierce warrior and the bruised boy, finding common ground in their shared wariness of the world. The youngest child, a girl named Sarah, who could not have been more than 5, claimed Ashki as her personal guardian. She would climb onto Ashki's shoulders and ride there for hours, delighting in being tall and seeing the world from a giant's perspective. And Ashki, who had spent her life feeling like a burden, discovered that to this small child she was not frightening, but wonderful. 3 weeks after the Garretts arrived, another family appeared. Then a single man, a former soldier who had been dishonorably discharged for refusing to participate in a massacre similar to Cibecue Creek. Then an elderly Apache woman who had been abandoned by her tribe when she became too old to contribute. Word was spreading. Somewhere out near the White River there was a place where the rejected could find acceptance, where those who did not fit into society's neat categories could build something new. Elias's small ranch became a compound. More cabins were built. A proper well was dug. Fields were cleared for planting. The work was endless, but so was the sense of purpose. People who had spent years believing they were worthless discovered they had value. People who had hidden their differences learned to stand tall. And at the center of it all was Elias Thorne, the reluctant leader who had only wanted to disappear. One evening, as he sat on the porch of the original cabin watching the compound bustling with activity, Kalyan joined him. She had become his closest companion, the one person who seemed to understand both who he had been and who he was becoming. "The elder would be proud," she said, following his gaze across the growing community. "The elder would probably point out all the ways we are doing this wrong," Elias replied, but he smiled as he said it. "That too," Kalyan agreed. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I have been thinking about what you said, about how this is dangerous, how we are making ourselves targets. We are. But there are some things worth being a target for, some stands worth taking even when the odds are against you." She looked at him directly. "You taught me that. You and the elder both. You showed me that hiding might be safer, but living requires being seen." "I am terrified every day," Elias admitted. "I wake up knowing that Clayton is out there planning something, knowing that the army might decide we are a threat, knowing that any day could bring violence we cannot stop." "Fear is not weakness," Kalyan said, echoing the words she had spoken to Ashki weeks ago. "It is wisdom. Only fools are not afraid. The question is what we do with the fear." "And what do we do with it?" Kalyan reached out and took his hand, her large fingers wrapping around his scarred palm. "We stand anyway. We build anyway. We live anyway. Because the alternative is to let fear make us small, and we have all been small for too long." Elias looked down at their joined hands, dark skin and light skin, giant and normal-sized Apache and white. A year ago, this simple connection would have been unthinkable. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I am glad you came to my door," he said quietly. "I am glad the elder sent you. I did not know it then, but I was dying in my solitude. Dying slowly, poisoned by guilt and isolation. You saved my life by asking me to save yours." "Then we are even," Kalyan said. "Because you saved mine by seeing me as human when the whole world insisted I was something else." They sat together as the sun set, watching their strange community settle in for the night. Children played in the yard. Adults gathered around cooking fires. Laughter drifted on the evening air, the sound so foreign to this place that had known only silence for so long. In Fort Thomas, Sheriff Clayton plotted his revenge. In the Apache camps, tribal councils debated what to do about the growing compound of outcasts. In distant army forts, officers received reports of an unauthorized settlement harboring fugitives and discussed military response. But here now in this moment, 23 people who had been rejected by the world found peace in each other's company. They had become something new. Not Apache, not white, not giant or normal or soldier or civilian. They had become a family built on choice rather than blood. They had become a refuge in a hostile world. They had become living proof that different people could stand together if they had the courage to try. And though storms were gathering on every horizon, though danger approached from every direction, they stood together under the desert stars and refused to be afraid. Because they had learned finally that standing together was stronger than hiding alone, that mercy was more powerful than vengeance, that the weight of being seen was lighter when carried by many shoulders. The giants had risen, and they would not fall easily. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Clayton. The compound had grown to 37 souls, each one carrying their own story of rejection and redemption. One afternoon, a group of 5 Apache approached on foot, not warriors this time, but families, a mother with 2 children, an old man who walked with a cane, a young couple holding hands. The woman at the front spoke in halting English. "We heard of a place where the outcasts are welcomed, where those who do not fit may find home. Is this that place?" Elias stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, Kalyan beside him, Naalnish and Ashki flanking them. Behind, the Garrett children played with Apache children, their laughter carrying on the desert wind. He looked at Kalyan. She nodded. "The door is open," Elias said. "Not because of pity, not because of obligation, but because I know what it means to have nowhere else to go." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "We have heard you stood against the army, against the sheriff, against all who would hurt those who are different." "We stood," Naalnish said simply, "and we will stand again if needed." As the new arrivals entered the compound, Elias felt Kalyan's hand slip into his. She spoke softly for him alone. "The elder would be proud, not of what we built, but of who we became in the building." Elias looked across the compound. Samuel Garrett taught carpentry to a young Apache man. Mary Garrett shared cooking techniques with an elderly woman from another tribe. Elizabeth studied healing herbs with Kalyan. Thomas practiced tracking with Naalnish, and Sarah rode on Ashki's shoulders, pointing at clouds and naming their shapes. Different people, different backgrounds, different sizes and colors and languages. But here in this place, built from mercy and necessity, they were simply family. "What do we call this place?" Kalyan asked. "People are starting to ask. They say it needs a name." Elias thought about Desba's final words, about Nol-E's gift, about 3 giant women who had walked to his door when he had nothing left to offer but space and stubbornness. "We call it what it is," he said. "A refuge, a home, a place where those the world rejected can stand tall." Kalyan smiled. The elder had a word for such places. He called them Bika Hojo Ogo. It means where people walk in beauty together. "Then that is what we are," Elias said. As the sun set over the White River Basin, casting long shadows across the growing settlement, Elias Thorne stood with his hand in Kalyan's and knew that he had finally found what he had been running from all along. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but purpose. The giants had risen. The outcasts had gathered. And in a forgotten corner of Arizona territory they had built something that would not be easily destroyed. Not because they were strong, but because they refused to stand alone.